All right, thank you, everybody. Hope you're not falling asleep from lunch, but here I come. And listening this morning, I kind of wondered, you know those Venn diagrams that if you make circles, there's a core. And I'm thinking about all of the talks and what you folks might be investigating and whether I'll be anywhere or just my own Venn diagram off on the side. But I'll start talking and we'll see what happens. So you can see my title there. I intend to be a case study rather than a person with answers. I'm not trying to teach you anything today. This is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna make a distinction between what we'll call causal explanation and causal description. And then the case study is gonna be one of my causal explanations or theories, fundamental cause theory. And then I'm gonna present a response to the use of my theory by folks who come from the potential outcomes area. And then their basic take on my theory is that you really need to break it down into its component parts and that the overall explanation can be sort of left behind. I'm going to point to what I see as problems with that breaking down approach and then end by suggesting that we may need more focus on causal explanation, what I'm going to call causal explanations, and there'll be issues of transparency, rigor, and reproducibility in their enactment. And how do we think about that? If we decide we like causal explanations at all, you could decide with the people that'll be in contention with me, I mean, we don't need them, but here we go. So as I said, I want to be a case study. And how do we evaluate the rigor, reproducibility, and transparency of what I'll call a causal explanation? And I aim to convince you that it's a problem that is not well addressed by extant counterfactual potential outcomes approaches. As to any answer from me about how to evaluate a causal explanation, I'll basically say, yeah, I don't know. I'm going to show you what I did, but would I want to have that made into a system of evaluating? Maybe not. I would like people's input about that. And the case study will be this fundamental cause theory. So this is where the distinction between causal description and causal explanation comes from. It's a quasi-experimental design book by Shadish, Cook, and Campbell. It's kind of a precursor to a lot of the counterfactual and potential outcomes kind of thinking about causation. And it's where the ideas of statistical conclusion, internal construct, and external validity of a causal inference come from. And many of us use those terms now. But they made this distinction between causal description and causal explanation. And these are quotes from them. Some research is particularly effective in describing the consequences attributable to deliberately varying a treatment. We call this causal description. Often this kind of work does, quote, less well in clarifying the mechanisms through which and the conditions under which that causal explanation holds, what we call causal explanation. I'm in the causal explanation camp. So just to make this very concrete, causal description was you come to the light switch, flip it on, the light goes on, and you can describe the cause by the flipping on of the switch. You can do a randomized study where you have assign people to come flip the switch and a random happen to go into a room and bang the wall next to the switch. And you'd find that there was a causal effect of flipping the switch. But then imagine that something goes wrong with the switch and the light doesn't go on. Then you might need to know, you might have to call the electrician. You might need to know about the circuitry, about what the mechanism between flicking the switch and the light bulb is, or maybe the tungsten and the light's gone out. You need to interrogate that and figure that out. That is getting into causal explanation. How does this work? So I'm going to give you the case for causal description in health research. And I think it's the dominant one in some domains anyway. The central task for population health research is to identify modifiable risk and protective factors that are candidate targets for intervention to improve population health. Specific treatments or interventions are conceptualized. Such candidates need to be pruned of candidate treatments that fail to show evidence of causality so that we can identify the most potent set of interventions for population health improvement. The critical issue in all of this is the rigorous assessment of the causality of a putative treatment. And then they go on to say that observational evidence is at best suggestive and potentially very misleading as to whether treatments or specific policy initiatives are actually causal effects. So you need rigorous designs, you need clinical trials, you need natural experiments, rigorous quasi-experimental strategies to try to make sure that treatment or that intervention or that specific policy has an impact on the outcome of interest. These approaches or variants of them are deployed to assess whether, oh, I just said that. So this provides provides direct policy relevant knowledge if we can do this. And you know, I'm not making this up. Maybe this is the way most of us think in this room, I'm not sure, but this is an example of a case for causal description. My great colleague, Maria Gleamar, gives it. A critical step for improving translation in the 21st century social epidemiology is to define and test exposures that correspond with directly modifiable risk factors. Clearly defined counterfactuals lay the groundwork for causal inference, and causal inference lays the groundwork for translation into population health improvements. So that's causal description. What is it meant? And what do I mean by causal explanation? Well, it's a further elaboration. You know, where does the electricity come from that goes into the switch that you click? How does it then all work? And what uses is it put to in turning on a light or executing someone? So a broader set of things get considered. So here I'm going to say in my head what a causal explanation is. It's a verbal explanation. You can tell it to your mom or dad. An understanding of why something happens. The explanation has empirical reference, that is, it touches down on things that you can look at. And if the explanation is true, then we should observe some fact or some set of facts. And good explanations will often have multiple empirical reference, not just one, and involve multiple if-then elements. The explanation touches down many places. And we evaluate whether an explanation is causal, an explanation, not a specific cause effect, by assessing the degrees of support it obtains when its if-then elements are tested. And maximum rigor is deployed to test as many associated if-then statements as possible, especially any linchpin ones. And by linchpin ones, I mean ones that if it fails, the theory's gone. Judgment as to the likely causal status of the explanation is derived by referring to its performance across the range of if-then tests it is produced, and a causal explanation is the goal. So I just point to a few things in there, multiple empirical reference, multiple if-then elements to test as many associated if-then statements as possible, and a performance across all of them is what you need to tell yourself whether your causal explanation is any good or not. Okay, so I have this perception that the technology of causal inference is better suited to causal description than causal explanation. Counterfactual thinking and potential outcomes approaches seek to determine whether a specific treatment causes a specific outcome. Randomized designs with randomization to specific treatments. Quasi-experimental efforts to isolate variation in treatments from exogenous variation so as to determine the treatment's impact on the outcome. The approach does not easily allow for an omnibus test of an explanation that involves a system of effects that might be changing over time. So I'm going to give you my case study example. It's about me, a theory I created with my wife. So let me start this development of the case study with a very robust set of descriptive facts from medical sociology and social epidemiology. You've all seen these. So maybe I don't need to spend a lot of time. This is self-rated health by income, with the green as the top level of income and blue is the lowest level of income. This is from the United States. And what you see there is in multiple ethnic groups, you see that gradient. And this is your self-rated health. And it's also true of life expectancy over here on the left. And if you go into social epidemiology, you see these kind of bar charts all the time. This is life expectancy at age 25, and you see the gradient overall, and then three ethnic groups, Black, Hispanic, and white, with respect to income in that particular side. On the right-hand side, you see more ethnic groups. Education's the indicator of socioeconomic status. And again, it's that self-rated health indicator. And again, you see these gradients. So they're there. And here's another way just of portraying the same kind of information, except you're seeing over time. And you're seeing it within three different groups, white men, white women, Black women. And you can, the non-solid lines are different levels of education, with the higher line being the highest educated group, having the longest life expectancy. And what you see, what's important in that slide is it's getting bigger. There's different explanations for why the lines are getting wider apart in the current era, but they're getting wider apart. So to carry this explanation a little further, the standard public health way of approaching when you find a distal outcome and a disease is say, well, what's the intervening mechanisms? What lies between? And if we know that, we'll know why the association between SES and mortality exists. So what's the X? And so we pop in things there. We'd have probably now, we're thinking now, smoking, it's arrayed by socioeconomic status, diet, exercise, stress, and a long list of others that are all spread out by your socioeconomic status. So if we do that, we will understand why the SES association exists is the answer. We will know what to do to address the health inequalities. We can focus on intervening mechanisms. We don't need to deal with the poverty and so on. We just figure out what the mechanisms are and address them. And if we can block those mechanisms, we can make the health inequalities go away. So do we believe this? Okay, maybe I'm going to disagree with you. Maybe if we live in a snapshot right now. So let me see if I can change our thinking a little bit and do a mind experiment. So imagine instead of asking what the mechanisms connecting SES to health are at the current time, that instead we were gathered in 1865 and asking the question then. Lincoln's president and Grant is accepting Lee's, he's given up. So what's the point? Imagine yourself back in Rhode Island in 1865 doing what we just did for the current data. We might have asked, what were the mechanisms involved? And at that time, we would have put in things like this. Extremely overcrowded housing, TB is a problem. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and more people are dying of TB, cholera, and smallpox. So imagine yourself back in Rhode Island in 1865 and doing what we just did for the current data. We might have asked, somehow these got repeated. Let's see. Okay, now we're up to where I want it to be. If we block them, right, it should make it go away. And we did block them. But the SES association is resilient. We still got it. It didn't go away. So there's something reproduced the mechanisms. So this led to the theory of fundamental causes. And that's me and my wife. And to the concept of fundamental social causes. So fundamental social causes involve resources such as knowledge, money, power, prestige, and beneficial social connections that determine the extent to which people are able to avoid risks and adopt protective strategies so as to reduce mortality and morbidity. And then this is the important part. Because such resources can be used in different ways, in different situations, fundamental causes have effects on disease, even when the profile of risk and protective factors changes radically. And it's their persistent effect on health in the face of dramatic changes in mechanisms and diseases that leads us to call them fundamental. So fundamental cause theory seeks to explain this persistence of health inequalities in different places and different times. We identify socioeconomic status, which I'm going to focus on today, racism and stigmatization as fundamental causes. Each one is related to multiple disease outcomes. So it's making predictions about multiple outcomes through multiple replaceable mechanisms. And the mechanisms are replaced in different places and different times so as to reproduce the fundamental relationship. So let me give you a diagram. This is a very simple diagram of what I'm talking about. So the FC is fundamental cause, the M's are mechanisms, and the idea is if a mechanism linking a fundamental cause to an outcome is blocked, the fundamental cause will find expression through another mechanism, thereby preserving the fundamental association. So that if we block that mechanism, the idea is that something else will come along and reproduce the association. So how would that happen in real life? It seems like diabolical magic. But the idea is this notion of flexible resources, because they're broadly useful across places and times. So when a new risk emerges or a new protective factor is discovered, the use of flexible resources shapes who benefits and who's harmed. So the discovery of a new health beneficial cancer screen, who gets it? And it gets spread out in ways that are unequal and creates a new inequality that didn't exist before it was discovered. Or the emergence of COVID, something bad comes along and people use their resources to protect themselves and create inequalities in the experience of COVID. So mechanisms are replaced because people deploy flexible resources in very different situations. So that's the argument for the mechanism generator. It creates mechanisms, is the idea of a fundamental cause. So just to give you an example of this, we already used COVID nicely once earlier, I'll use COVID again. So think about the early stages of COVID, the epidemic, stages of the epidemic. People weren't aware they were being infected, right at the beginning. Didn't realize it had come into their area, into their social network. So could they use their flexible resources at that moment to protect themselves? No, they didn't know what was going on. Given that it spread internationally, who's most likely to be infected first? Just kind of the accident of history. Who's going to get it first? Well, it's going to turn out to be international world travelers, people who take cruises, people who go to expensive ski resorts. There were all those outbreaks in the ski areas in the west of the United States and in Italy and so on. And then elites like the former Prime Minister of England and the current now King Charles of England. And you can also see this in data, and I'll just give a couple of examples. So early on, this is Spain and Italy early on, and at the bottom is the per capita income in their states in Italy and in Spain. And what happened early in the epidemic was that we got expressed in the richer areas. The death rates were higher in the richer parts of Spain and Italy very early on. So, but then will fundamental cause processes shift the epidemic? So early on, this is how it came in. Who can't social distance? You all know this list. People in essential jobs, who can work at home and has a place to do so, who lives in tight living quarters, who gets groceries delivered, who can retreat to weekend homes, who has hospitals, gets the ventilators, who gets the first access to vaccines. People in higher levels of SES can use their flexible resources to protect themselves in all of those ways. So the shape of the pandemic should change from the elites that it first affected to others. So we tried to test this using US counties and SES level of US counties. And on the left-hand side, you see the time it took for a first case to emerge in a county by 3 levels of SES of the county. And what you see is that the first case occurred more rapidly in high SES counties and less quickly in low SES counties. But then on the right-hand side is once the first case is expressed, how fast in those counties does the incidence grow? And it grows much more rapidly in low SES. This is a way of our trying to test this with COVID data. And I'll just have two more of these, and then I'll get out of my riff about the fundamental cost theory and talk about the other stuff. So here's COVID in January 2021 and death rates per 100,000 by states in the United States. And on the right-hand side is all-cause mortality in the United States. So over here is that, you sort of what you'd expect for disease by SES. The rates are going to be much higher in the states that have lower median incomes. This is kind of like normal. But COVID's not normal yet. It's early in the epidemic. And if it's sort of flat, if it's correlated at all, it's positively correlated. Now, this is it right now, sort of. And they look just like it's all-cause mortality, and that's COVID mortality. So we transformed this thing into something that was kind of like normal mortality and normal kind of SES. It didn't start that way. We made it that way, the fundamental cause theme about it. So I use that just to let you see how this thinking goes. And it's a causal explanation. So far we have this distinction between causal description and causal explanation. We have fundamental cause theory as an example of a causal explanation. An example of fundamental cause theory applied to the emergence of COVID mortality inequalities. But is there utility to a causal explanation like fundamental cause theory? So of course I think so, but not everybody does. Here's Morgan and Winship, whose book on counterfactuals and causal inference, pretty strong effect in the social sciences, but particularly in sociology, which is my home discipline. And so here's what they're saying about fundamental cause thinking. A fundamental cause orientation may be useful in challenging the status quo in research areas that have become too narrowly focused on only a few relevant causal pathways. But a widespread adoption of the fundamental cause orientation to causal analysis would not be productive. Instead, we see the counterfactual perspective and the potential outcome model in particular as enabling the pursuit of a more ambitious goal, the careful delineation of the relevant causal states that lie within any purported fundamental causes, and then the estimation of the specific effects generated by contrast between them. So don't do fundamental cause type thinking, break it down into smaller projects. So here's some problems with using a causal description to test fundamental cause as a causal explanation from my point of view. Fundamental cause involves the deployment of flexible resources across multiple diseases, not just one, through multiple mechanisms. And some part of the truth value of the explanation depends on its performance across all of those predictions. It predicts the creation of new mechanisms. It proposes that new mechanisms arise. This implies the need to examine multiple X to Y relationships and the same X to Y relationship over time. And if you cannot do that, you cannot test the explanation. So why not just implement tests via causal description and causal description mechanism by mechanism, one X to Y, then another X to Y. And the reason is that mechanisms are always changing. If you go one by one, you'll never understand the robust endurance of the SES association across places and time. You wouldn't have been able to predict what would happen with COVID. You wouldn't have experienced it yet. So this is me talking to, you see I'm a little defensive, they say this, they're important people, and they attack my theory and say it's not the way to go. So you put all that in your hopper, and take everything I say with a grain of salt from that point of view. But it also applies, I think, to other theories. If a causal explanation has multiple empirical reference and involves multiple predictions, then its truth value should depend on how it fares across all of them. And one-by-one causal description does not achieve this. So they can't do it if you like causal explanations by just breaking it down. There's no explicit way to give a causal explanation credit for making multiple correct predictions. There's sort of intuition tells us it should get it, but there's no explicit way of doing that. If a causal explanation specifies the conditions under which it will operate, person, place, time, and other aspects of context, then it should get credit for its success across multiple such specifications. One-by-one causal description does not allow that. If, as is often stated, a theory is a set of interrelated propositions, then a theory should be evaluated across its success with regard to those interrelated propositions, and this cannot be adjudicated using a causal description framework. And I'd say, though, in your training, almost all of your training about the rigor of causal inference is about causal description, I think. I could be wrong, you'll tell me later. Or you can put your hand up now and shut me up for a while. So how did we try to address, well, we want to know whether this idea is really right or we should toss it out and get a new one. So we identified 3 generic tests with the key feature of each involving circumstances in which these flexible SES related resources can be more or less effectively deployed to garner a health advantage. To the extent that such flexible resources can be effectively deployed, we expect the SES association with disease to emerge. To the extent that flexible resources cannot be used, we expect a much weaker SES to disease association. So we're trying to derive from the theory predictions that can touch down an empirical reference. We have 3 ways of doing this: disease preventability approach, the preventability shift approach, and manipulated preventability approach. How am I doing on time? Does anybody know how I'm doing on time? Anyway, I'll keep going. I'll do these. The disease preventability approach is across all causes of death. Some causes are more preventable, either because disease occurrence is preventable or because once a disease occurs, death from the disease can be prevented. So lower preventability types of diseases are pancreatic cancer and brain cancer. And we expect a reduced gradient for the SES association with those diseases. So me, John Roberts, and me, and the guy who sells me coffee are in the same boat. We can't do anything to prevent this disease. And so we would expect the same probability of death from it. On the other hand, high preventability diseases like lung cancer, coronary heart disease, and so on, we expect a stronger SES association. And then we've done tests that are like that. Then the second kind of test we do is examine SES mortality association before and after death from a disease becomes preventable. So these are some that have gotten more preventable death from them: colon cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, and COVID, as per my example. And here's a couple of slides showing them. So that's colon cancer. And we figured out things to do for colon cancer with good screening and colonoscopy. And the top line on the left-hand side is higher SES areas of the counties in the country, and the bottom line, top line is higher SES, and the bottom line is lower SES. So it actually used to be higher in higher SES counties. Over time, as we figured out what to do, the lines start to come down, but they come down unequally, such that the higher SES line comes down much faster, creating an inequality at the current time. So in the pre-time, we didn't know what to do to prevent it. We figured out how to prevent it. It's good for us because the mortality rate goes down, but it creates an inequality because of the distribution of the benefits that we've figured out how to achieve. Now, lung cancer is different. We figured out that smoking is a risk factor for lung cancer. And again, that the SES levels are all about the same in 1950. Then over time, the higher SES starts to come down sooner, and the bluer line, the lower SES, continues to rise, and we get a disparity at the current time. We didn't know how to protect ourselves from cancer in 1950 because we hadn't discovered yet that it was a cause of cancer. Majority of the people, when the data first came out, didn't believe that smoking was a cause of cancer when the evidence first came out. Okay, and then the final way we've tried to test it is what we call manipulated preventability. In this instance, the fundamental cause prediction is that when effective interventions are randomly assigned, but require resources to be most effectively adopted, inequalities will emerge. In the active intervention group, higher SES individuals can use resources to extract maximum benefit from the effective intervention, whereas lower SES individuals are impeded in their capacity to do so. So basically implementing the intervention in the active intervention arm, higher SES people, if it requires effort, might have a benefit in in the active arm. However, in the placebo arm, where they're not getting an active treatment, they can still scamper to implement the protocol, but it doesn't do them any good. So the fundamental cause prediction would be in the active arm, you'll see an SES gradient. In the placebo arm, you won't see an SES gradient. So far and almost done, we have the causal explanation, causal description, just fundamental cause as a causal explanation. You have Morgan and Winship, fundamental cause approach not productive, instead address the components separately via causal description. My contention is that we miss a lot of value by doing so for fundamental cause theory, but for causal explanation more generally. How have we tried to capture what is essential to fundamental cause? The ability to use the flexible resources to avoid death and define variation in that to test the theory. And with respect to reproducibility, we did a review of everybody's tests of those 3 types of tests and published it in this review paper. So that's kind of like the reproducibility of those tests and how we tried to deal with that. So options or considerations concerning rigor and reproducibility for causal explanations. One is forget causal explanation and break things down into causal description. And that can be congenial with a lot of you, and that's just what you want to do. Or engage in causal explanations and apply your expertise in rigor, reproducibility, and transparency to them. Well, my perception is that the domain of causal inference, we invest much more effort in the tools of causal description and very little in what it takes to engage in causal explanation. And I have a few suggestions about enhancing transparency, rigor, and reproducibility with respect to causal explanations. And they're kind of obvious maybe, but we don't teach each other how to do them. And we don't have any set procedures for evaluating. So here they come. So first, in constructing a causal explanation, how do you do it? First of all, do we teach people that? How do you create such explanations and make the explanatory part transparent? A lot of people have theories and you read them and you really have a hard time knowing precisely what the empirical reference would be. And it's kind of murky and people can kind of wiggle around. How can we make the explanation itself as clear as possible so that it can be translated by anyone into predictions about empirical reference? And then attention to the logic connecting an explanation to empirical reference. How do you make sure that the prediction is carefully derived from the explanation? That would be a reproducibility, so that if I laid out the theory and asked someone else to make a connection to the empirical referent, would my logical process getting to that be replicated by someone else who also has looked into the theory. Then how do we locate critical linchpin tests of explanations, risky tests, ones that are more likely to separate between the truth value of a theory. And then judging the causal status of an explanation in light of evidence from multiple if-then tests across multiple empirical reference. How do we assess the overall performance of the explanation across all of them? So I think it's sort of seat of the pants. This looks like it's working. Read my article, most times it worked. But how do we actually, is there any other way to do that? And how do we talk to each other about how to do that? And how much disconfirming evidence do you need to discard a theory? So it doesn't work once, is it gone? And what kind of norms do we develop around that? And what kind of a test would lead us to say, nope, it's gone, or how many times would it have to fail? Is one failure enough? How do we judge how many failures are needed to discard? And that would be rigor and reproducibility. So here's what I believe at the end, and sort of I gave myself kind of this, I'm coming in here and I really don't know how to do this, but I do have strong views, as you can sort of see. I'm a person that thinks causal explanation is really important. And I'm not only going to say that, I'm going to say it's better. It's better. It subsumes issues of causal description within it, but seeks to put questions of X causing Y in a broader explanatory framework. And the explanations allow deeper knowledge that's more transportable. I'm not sure if you're going one by one, whether you would have made a prediction about COVID. Maybe you would have. But I think it needed systemic thought to say, okay, there are ways we can protect ourselves from this disease. It's coming into our country. It's coming in via elites, and it's going to shift. You're going one by one from the past. I don't know. But I think it is useful in telling that story, the theory, the explanation. So, and some domains of research are currently dominated by causal description concerns. And I think to the detriment of broader questions that causal explanations pose. It's not everybody who does this, but this causal description repertoire, which is beautiful, people like to show they can enact it. So sometimes they go around looking for places, some little bit of exogenous variation that they can deploy to answer some question. But what does it add up to? Is it really, what is it testing? You might find out about the specific thing that happened, a specific policy, but there's nothing more general about it. So I think we should do more to develop causal explanation and to ensure that it's done with transparency, rigor, and reproducibility. So I'm done. Thanks for listening.